Well, hello everyone. My name's John Euler, and this is Journey to Healing. Welcome as we do a deep dive into the topic of boundaries. We have been doing a deep dive into the topic of boundaries for a while. We are now going to get very practical. We've set the stage for understanding when boundaries are applicable, when they need to be implemented. We are now going to look at how to begin the process and make sure there's a goodness of fit. To be able to access previous podcasts, simply go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab. There's an ever-growing repository of podcasts. I'm a little delayed in getting some of them up there, so be sure either to subscribe to those videos or check back often. We're looking at boundaries, why they're important, and when are they applicable. We've spent quite a few weeks developing the premise, or hopefully developing an understanding, but setting forth the premise that boundaries are not only important, but they are necessary. They're actually very godly. If I cannot have boundaries, then I cannot protect myself. I cannot protect that which is important, including if I have kids, I cannot protect them from professional grade pigs. We use that term that comes out of Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Jesus used the word or the term pigs for those that are selfish, and not just mildly selfish, but very, very profoundly selfish. There's a difference between human error, faults, failings. Nobody's perfect. There's a difference between that and what we're talking about and what Jesus is talking about. When he references the term pigs. Also the idea of a fool in the Old Testament and New Testament. That is what we're talking about. That is not a casual thing. By the time somebody morphs into a fool, they are very different. Modern day psychology has come along, looked at brain scans of people that have morphed into uniquely selfish individuals, and psychology calls them psychopaths. Biblically, back 2,000 years ago, they used the term reprobate. Now, we think in terms of reprobate as being sexually deviant, though that oftentimes is the case, but that is not necessarily the case. It is somebody who has been given over, almost judicially, almost as a sentence, but by the time somebody is at that stage, they don't even have clue one. They believe they are making the decision, which they are, but they believe they're actually becoming free. They're becoming top dog, alpha male, the top cheese, boss bow wow. I've heard all sorts of things having worked in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. And of course, we tend to think of prisons as being filled with psychopaths, and that's true. But sometimes on both sides of the bars. I kid you not. So we'll describe that here in a moment. But the movies have given a sense of, a lot of different movies, that a psychopath is one of the bloody psychopaths, the impulsive kind of psychopath. That's actually not necessarily who we're talking about. We're talking about sophisticated white-collar psychopaths. Those are people who have completely given themselves permission to override their conscience so it doesn't bother them anymore. And much kind of goes against what we see in the movies. The reality is this. Typically, if someone is sophisticated and they become hardened of heart, or hardened in their heart, they're going to look increasingly normal. That's really crucial. It's not that the worse someone gets, the more you can spot them in a crowd. Actually, the worse someone gets in terms of their conscience, they will be much more likely to find themselves in positions of power. They know how to climb the corporate ladder. They will step on anyone to get there, and they will seek out positions of power where they can exercise power and control, dominance. And if they give themselves over to sexual deviance, then they will begin a progressive stair-step fashion downward, a trek downward, that goes through very predictable stages and winds up with a hunger and a thirst after defiling and defrauding. And that's why at the end of that process is child predation, child predators. Child predators always start with adult pornography. There is a misnomer out there that because it benefits child predators, and they've gotten it into the literature because a lot of the academic researchers do what? To research child predators, where do they go? They go into the prison system, meaning they will work towards getting interviews. There's a lengthy process. I'm very familiar with how that works, and so only certain ones will volunteer or be selected. And so the method is crucial. If you are interviewing someone who has harmed others, the method is crucial because those that have harmed others typically are not only are they self-centered, we know that, but they're typically very tricky. They have a reason why they're going to sit for an interview. And those in the realm of sex offending, they are the most tricky, as it were. They are the most deceptive of all categories of individuals, and that's why it usually takes them a long time before they're caught. So if you sit down with someone who has been sex offending, by the time they're finally arrested, and the stats are that I've heard that I think are probably pretty accurate, that only 1 in 1,000, so Dr. Marshall out of Canada has indicated in the Canadian system about only 1 in 1,000 of men that do time for sex offenses. There are 1,000 that don't, meaning 1 out of 1,000 end up going to prison. So how many of these individuals are tricky enough to get away with it? So all that to say, it depends upon your method. It depends upon how you are interviewing people. But aside from sex offenders or those that have harmed in that way, by the time somebody gives themselves permission to override their conscience, they are becoming much more adept at manipulating. It's easy, as it were, to be impulsive, but you, at some point in time, are going to be stopped in one way or another, or you will manage others by brute force, by overt threats. People vote with their feet. And if you are not talented in manipulating others, if you are just right out in the open, unbearable to be around, then the first chance someone gets, they're going to leave. So cult leaders, sociopaths, we'll describe that in a moment, they are adept at manipulating. And so in order to get someone to stay around you, if you are selfish, you have to either use the carrot or the stick. You have to promise them something, or you have to create fear in them so that they don't leave. And the smarter you are, you'll be able to manipulate and use actually a combination of those. Think about cults. Cults will dangle a carrot. Oftentimes it's get rich quick, or it's you stay around them and you'll benefit. So they're going to emphasize the benefit. If they decide to leave, then you're going to emphasize the fear. Either of those are great, unfortunately, great motivators to cause someone to stay put. So cults and adept manipulators will utilize those two methods. In the past, we've looked at Mother Gothel in the movie Tangled. You can go back and look at some of the podcasts. She is a classic white-collar psychopath. We call her a controlling mother, but when Rapunzel finally figured out that all the interactions that Mother Gothel has had with her, all the pretense of caring so much, she would go on and on. Oh, I love you more. They have this little back and forth exchange, but Mother Gothel knew how to throw around the word love, and she would leave Rapunzel in an inner state of confusion to where she didn't understand and she couldn't trust her intuition. And that's another thing manipulators will go after. They will go after your intuition so that you cannot double check. You cannot trust yourself. And so they've overridden their conscience. So the only thing left to prevent them from taking everything that you have, everything that's important to you, Jesus called those he called that pearls. Those are your pearls, your time, effort, energy, resources, everything about you, including your opinion and your preference. If you are around a selfish person, they won't tell you they are not constrained by their conscience any longer. So they will now move towards encroaching upon your boundaries, and they will without pulling out a gun. If they do that, their time is pretty limited, right? So they're going to do something as far as manipulation to get you to move your boundaries in. So they are adept at using guilt, using mental persuasion and manipulation, and again, causing you to second guess yourself. So the importance of boundaries cannot be underestimated, because that is going to be the thing that helps you move towards your goals and keeps your pearls, and so that you don't end up with a life of regrets. If you give your life on behalf of a selfish person, they win, you lose. And it's not about win-lose, but you will have spent your time, effort, and energy for naught. And then at the end of your life, or at the end of their life, you will be confused, you will be tied up in knots. I deal with clients that have not been able to completely resolve these issues, and so when it comes to the funeral of someone, let's say a mother or a father, that was a selfish pig, that was a manipulator, that was hurtful. Now comes the last days, if there is a bedside experience where you can go and say goodbye, they're a wreck. Why? Because they haven't had a chance to really come to terms with truth. They're still trying to figure out, based upon what the other person, the manipulator, has said or done, they're trying to figure out a way how to connect, and they can't. And so they're in turmoil, and it is tragic to watch. And some of you have experienced that. So to be able to set boundaries beforehand is crucial, so that when that time comes, so that you have a choice. You have a choice to what extent are you going to be involved, and to what extent are you going to protect yourself emotionally. Because funerals and weddings, but funerals, if you want to watch family dynamics, you go to a funeral or a wedding and you're going to see that. Okay, so you need to be able to have boundaries. In order to do that, you need to know what boundaries are. You need to be able to be sure that you can have them. And we've looked at some of those. I recommend the podcasts, How Big of a Pig, also the Warthog assessment. That'll help you get a sense of, on a scale of 1 to 10, where does this person fall? And we're going to look at some of that material. So that's good material to set the stage for what we looked at last time at the very end of last podcast. We were looking at the best way to view boundaries. We have boundaries that are understood in terms of, understood in terms of society. So there are structural and functional boundaries. That means that you matter. You need to know that you matter. And then if and when you get married, then that relationship is not only vital, and it is central to you. So the most central thing to you is you and God. But then your relationship with your spouse, that should not be encroached upon, and the law indicates that the husband and wife relationship is to be honored. Then when you have kids, you don't need to earn the right for parental rights. You have them the moment your child is born. That should not be encroached upon. Then look what concentric circle is just outside of that. You have extended family and in-laws. And I threw in close friends. Church friends are going to be outside of that. But problems happen, for instance, when extended family and in-laws do not abide by the parameters of parent and child. If in-laws, or outlaws, as they sometimes become, right? The 4 big issues in marriage are money, sex, in-laws, and kids. And so if parents have not cut the strings, apron strings, or if the adult kids have not left and cleft, the leaving and cleaving, you're going to find that they will, one or the other, will permit somebody in between the parents and the children. And that is crucial to make sure that does not happen. So if you have a meddling in-law, on the one hand, shame on them, but ultimately it comes down to the parents. They have to invite the in-laws outside of that concentric circle. Then you have church family and friends. If church family ends up, and this is kind of tricky, but if you have a pastor that ends up being more important than anybody in that person's life, then you have the makings of a cult. Okay? And if you have a church that tells you to cut everybody off, by the way, be very careful about that. And then casual acquaintances and polite society. Those are, that's a pretty good way to view kind of functional and structural boundaries. But let me bring that up again. But when you look at that, the question is this: is that where people should stay? Meaning this: if you're in that concentric circle, does that mean that in terms of genuine intimacy, is that where you are? No. Ideally, yes, but no. So you can have, in terms of structural and functional, you can have, let's say, your parent who knows his or her place. It sounds funny, but right, that they will abide by the parents. It's going to be their adult kids. So let's say you have a difference of opinion. You as the parent, you have an adult child, they're going to raise their child in some, maybe a little different way. There are a number of things that can cause an older parent to be a little uneasy. You have things about nutrition. You have things about discipline. You have things about bedtime. You have things about what they're going to watch. Schooling. You know, do they go to public school? A big contention, a point of contention is homeschooling. Families do that. That can create all sorts of issues. How about expectations as far as holidays? Are you going there? Are they coming there? You're going to be able to start your own tradition. But all that to say, is it possible to have structurally somebody outside those concentric circles further out, but actually be closer emotionally, that you feel closer to them than even your own family? Or maybe somebody that should be in one of the closer concentric circles, and this is pertinent for our conversation now, could they end up placing themselves in one of the further concentric circles out? What do I mean by that? Well, if you have a parent who should be able to recognize your parental authority, should value your spouse, they should never come in between you and your spouse. Now, if a spouse is abusive, that's different. But all things being equal, parents should not undermine the relationship of their adult children's marriage. Why? Because it's sacred. There's a line, as it were, that says do not cross. But what happens if they start transgressing, they start crossing those boundaries? Then, though functionally and structurally, you will typically interact with your parents and your extended family more than, let's say, the average person, and you will probably spend holidays with them. The question is, where are they in terms of your heart of hearts and appreciation and trust? Just because they're a part of your family doesn't necessarily mean that they value you like they should. So you could have somebody that's structurally and functionally involved in your life, but they aren't necessarily all that close to you, or they shouldn't have access. Why? Because if they are selfish, then they're going to do damage. So you can have within a family, and this is what we've been talking about, you can have within a family, you can have a pig. You can have a selfish person. And we need to be able to discern. If I cannot discern, then I'm going to open myself up for frustration. So the graphic that we used was the best way to view this in terms of boundaries is not so much structural or functional, because some people will say blood is thicker than water. Or how about this one? You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. Really? The best way to begin to view and understand boundaries, being able to implement boundaries, is understand relationships on a continuum. So looking at the graphic again, this is the best way to view where people are at in your life. Because if somebody has been hurtful, then they have removed themselves from the inner concentric circles, and they are now dropping in position. So in pole position, they end up at a 1. That is really important, because if I don't understand that relationships can ebb and flow, that relationships take work. But if I begin to become disrespectful, the person will not feel close to me, but I can guilt them. If I'm a sophisticated manipulator in a family, I can guilt them into feeling like I get to be in the number 10 position. No, that is not true. For instance, we talked about the issue of forgiveness. By the way, true forgiveness will be very evident, or true contrition will be evident, and therefore forgiveness will follow. I indicated that forgiveness is granted, but intimacy is earned. So let's say your parent, I'm just using that as an example, but it can also be adult children. Okay, so any relationship. Let's say you and your parents, and again, I don't have anything against parents. I am one, and I have some. Okay, but Jesus talked about that he did not necessarily come to bring peace, but a sword, and he describes various family relationships that sometimes will not end up well. Why? Jesus is all about forcing issues of truth. And if boundaries have been crossed, for instance, if a mother-in-law or a mother or a father encroaches upon the sacred union, that relationship, that space between parent and child or parent and parent, then they are wrong and they need to be pushed back. They need to be pushed back in wisdom, meaning boundaries need to be pushed back. If you wait for a selfish person to change, how long are you going to be waiting? Long time. So again, we talked in terms of looking at these various concentric circles, and this is by choice. Ultimately, your choice. You have the right to have anybody at any of these levels. That if someone hasn't earned the right, you do not have to feel obligated or guilty. As a matter of fact, the likelihood is this: if someone has treated you properly and with respect, guess what number they're going to be at? You won't even have to, you'll know that, because a level 10 person is a very encouraging kind of person, and they, little by little, will become more important. Whereas you may have a parent that ideally should be at a 10, should be very close to you. And again, that's different than you and God or you and your spouse. Okay, I kind of changed the analogy again. Okay, look at the chart again. So number 10 is really the most important, that inner spot of trust in your heart, trust and appreciation. Okay, so anybody can be in there. There's no limit, but the reality is this: very few people will end up demonstrating they're able to be at a 10, and they're willing and able to be at a 10. So it's important to begin to think in terms of relationships being at that level. Now, I want to add one other graphic. So you saw the scale of 1 to 10, okay? But the 1 is actually casual. Okay, we call it a fair weather friend. It is not somebody who's selfish. I'm going to now show you when we have somebody who is selfish, it looks like that. So, degrees of intimacy in human relationships are best viewed on a continuum. And you can go from very close all the way to very casual, and then becoming hurtful. And what do we call that? Well, I call those degrees of selfishness or degrees of trustworthiness. That is how you view human relationships, especially interpersonal relationships. You have relationships that you can place anywhere on that continuum. And the good news is this: any of us, depending upon how we act and how we behave and how we treat someone with respect, I'm trying to bring me back here, can be anywhere in those circles. So generally speaking, if I am trustworthy, I'll probably find that someone is willing to do what? Willing to begin to open up to me. So I am moving toward those the innermost concentric circles. But if I start to become selfish, what happens? I start to move myself further back. It's not the person. So this is on the inside of a person. If I end up on the outside of this concentric circle, let me bring that up again. If I end up by my degrees of selfishness being way outside of somebody's inner circle, meaning in their heart of hearts, if someone doesn't feel close to me, the question is this: as far as a decent person, the question is this: whose fault is it? And does that other person have to apologize? No, they don't. So, come Mother's Day, as a matter of fact, I'll bring the chart again. Come Mother's Day, how do you feel? As a matter of fact, we're coming up to the holidays. Are you looking forward to it? Or are you dreading it? Well, based upon the chart, can you tell me why? When you think of the people around the Thanksgiving table that you're going to be around, what number are they at? And you can find, based upon those numbers, whether or not you have compulsive behaviors going on during the holidays or whenever you're around that person. Let me bring the chart back for a moment. Let me ask you this. With alcoholic homes and when there's arguments because of alcohol, what number relationships do you think you've got in that family? Probably got a lot of selfishness going on. So why are they around them? Because maybe they have a sense of obligation because they feel that, well, let me see if I can bring it up. They feel that, well, after all, look, parents, you have to have, you can't choose your parents, really? Well, if they're consistently selfish, then it is time that maybe I have to have boundaries. So we're going to look at that same chart now as looking at a bell-shaped curve, meaning this. If I take that same chart right there and I lay it on its side, we're now going to look at, right? Now we're going to look at, to what extent do we have selfish people in society and in our lives? The more selfish someone is, the more extreme they are. It's also true, and extreme also means rare, but you can have a family that's filled with, it's very rare. Actually, it's not so rare as we would think, but you can have a whole family that is outside the bell-shaped curve, far enough. But you can look at this, then it's sort of normal. If I'm looking at this bell-shaped curve, and some people would say, well, you know what, everybody's selfish. What are they talking about? Well, normally people will have selfish people in their lives. Okay, and that's true. But the question is this: as somebody becomes increasingly selfish and moves out toward, let's say, the right, should you be around them? Because you can have then a relationship that is very extreme, and it's going to be hurtful. The one thing Jesus said is, do not cast your pearls before swine. We're going to look at what happens and how do you identify those people that you should or shouldn't be around. We're going to begin to look at what also happens when I try to interact with and I try to be close to someone who is on the lower end of the continuum. That is where the vast majority of depression and anxiety in relationships come from. Very few people are aware of it, but it is extremely important to understand it, because that is where, if you go to counseling, ultimately that's where a lot of counseling should focus on what kind of relationships do you have, and is there goodness of fit? And we will continue looking at goodness of fit in terms of boundaries on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by John Euler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with John Euler about your situation or in having John conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.